Okay, today's date is April 26th, and I am here on Kamlan with Sophie Lou.
Hello.
Hey.
We're ready to have a good conversation.
Yes. Okay, so I kind of wanted to, I feel like I already explained this a little bit, but I kind of just wanted to, talk a little bit about, why I wanted to, make this exhibit, or kind of, I feel like I already explained this a little bit to you, but,
Yeah.
I feel like, do I have to?
I think it's worth saying because I think it frames probably what we're going to talk about really well. Yeah.
Okay, so basically, coming into this class, I think it's very fair to say that, as a Black woman, I had very specific notions of both femininity, but also, stereotypes and, conceptions about, Korean womanhood and Korean femininity that, I haven't really done the work to kind of unpack, but I feel like by me taking this class, and I didn't even know it was a women gender studies class. I literally found out through it from the learning language Korean courses.
Oh, I was the opposite.
Yeah,
okay.
And so I didn't even know that we were going to be discussing all these different types of concepts about femininity and Korean womanhood. And so I kind of wanted to talk about kind of how this class allowed me to kind of deconstruct my misconceptions about Korean womanhood and femininity, and kind of allow through the memoirs that we read and the narratives that we read, allow Korean women specifically to define Korean womanhood and femininity.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of where I wanted to take this project and this exhibit. So yeah.
Okay, that's interesting though that you say you didn't know that it was the women's studies lens, because that's what I came in for, and I feel a lot of our conversations that we've had after class, we complain about how we wish there's more time spent on specifically Asian American or just Korean womanhood.
Exactly.
So I feel you definitely have and you have a background too where you I feel read a lot of feminist texts and have the lens to see these things through. So yeah, that's interesting.
Sure. Okay, so I don't know one question that I did have was how do you define womanhood?
Oh my god.
I know, it's a deep, I know it's a deep,
yeah.
right off the bat. Yeah.
Okay. How do I define womanhood? Honestly, okay, I could give you the way that I define it in a cynical way that I feel most of society defines it, and then the way that I've learned to define it.
Let's do the cynical one first, because
okay.
I do want to get into our own personal definitions of womanhood next.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think honestly, especially coming from the perspectives that I come from, in regards to race, sexuality, even just background, American woman, I feel womanhood here is defined always just in reference to maleness. And so you are the woman in every relationship that you're in, so relative to a man, so your role in society and the way you're perceived is the opposite of, or the inferior subordinate to a man, which is defined through the American notion of motherhood, for example. It's you exist to replenish maleness, and you exist to kind of prop up your children, rather than being your own, having your own kind of self-created role in that dynamic. And so I have obviously a lot of issues with this construction of womanhood, but I think that it's super, super prevalent. And even honestly, the way we viewed a lot of the texts that we read in class, I feel that shines through, because we focus a lot on not that this is inherently bad or anything, but we focus on whether someone was a good mother, rather than maybe
exactly.
the work that they did, in a way that a man kind of can just do whatever, and then those things are it's good if you... I think we
talked about that with was it Kim San or...
Yeah, Kim San versus Park In-duk.
Yes.
Where it's he was kind of just allowed to do whatever, and we focus on that, and then an after note is oh, and by the way, he abandoned his family.
Yeah,
whereas
exactly.
Park In-duk, it's oh, she abandoned her family.
She's not
but
a
as
good
a side
woman,
note,
she's not a good mom. Yeah.
So I feel that is where a lot of our ideas of womanhood come from, and I think it's harmful to everyone involved though.
Absolutely.
And so that's why it's interesting. But now obviously people are doing work to deconstruct womanhood, but then it calls into question how relevant these definitions even are, and all of this.
Yeah.
But In short, that is my cynical definition.
Okay. No, and I 100% agree. I think I share, well, we don't really have a choice. Like, this is something that, like, society pushes onto us about, like, this is how we define womanhood, and it's very tethered to the idea of, like, maleness and malehood and, like, manhood. And so, like, I 100% agree with you in terms of that definition. But, like, in terms of, like, that conversation and about, like, how society defines womanhood for us, like, what were some expectations that you think were put onto you from childhood and also, like, to adulthood around, like, your womanhood, or, like, even in terms of, like, femininity and, like, masculinity and, like, all those different types of things?
Oh my god, there's so much there, honestly, because, like, I have these two warring, like, sides of my upbringing where, like, my mom, honestly, never imposed such things onto me, which I could get into, like, a little bit more, but I think my greater, like, environment always projected an idea of, like, submissiveness and femininity onto me, probably as a function of, like, being, like, a Korean woman, but also, like, I was, like, the second child. My older brother is, like, obviously the first, and so, like, relative to him, I was always, like, for example, for, like, gifts from extended family, oldest son always gets, like, the most, and then second daughter gets kind of, like, the afterthought type thing. I would always, like, I don't know, I guess, like, at the table, like, when my dad was still, like, living with us, like, my mom and I would take on, you know, like, all the household related stuff to, like, make the men comfortable and all of this. And even, like, this, I don't know, I guess, like, the cliche stereotypical things in, like, the classroom, it's, like, the girls always have a certain role, and then the boys, like, have the teacher being like, oh, like, can some of the big strong men, like, come help me? So
with the desk.
It's literally the desk. And so, like, I think I share those, like, kind of superficial things with a lot of, like, other women, like, in their childhood and upbringing. But the thing that, like, I think differentiated a lot of the way I was able to construct my, like, relation to my gender is that my mom, she's, like, I want to say almost, like, matriarchal in our family, because, like, my dad stopped being involved in my life, like, in middle school. My mom had to take care of me and my brother, like, single-handedly, so she, like, started to, like, work a bunch. She's, like, a classically trained pianist, which doesn't really lend itself to, like, earning, so she'd pick up, like, 2-3 jobs. She was, like, basically the breadwinner and was doing, like, all the household things in a way that reframed household tasks for me as not a gendered / like, woman subservient thing, but as, like, this is, like, a family making thing. That is imposed onto women a lot, but it's not inherently, like, delicate, fragile, or, like, less work. It's, like, honestly, like, a ton of work, and it made her, I don't know, she was both, like, the mom and the dad, but, like, reframe motherhood to me in that way. And she also, like, never really imposed, I think, the role of daughter onto me so much as, like, she let the way that I, like, my interests and, like, the way I was a daughter to her inform the way she saw me. So, like, for example, my brother made it really clear early on that he was not going to take care of my mom. He was like, oh, like, you're not going to live with me. Like, I'm not going to, you know, like, change my career path to, like, make more so that I can support you. And I was like, I'll do that. Like, from middle school, and I'm going to talk about this also in my project, I, like, made a contract to her where I was like, oh, like, I'm going to, like, live in a house, like, on the same block as you. And, like, when you get old, like, I'm going to take care of you. And I remember she, like, made this comment once about, like, Ellen DeGeneres being, like, the man one in her lesbian relationship because she's, like, the provider. And she would, like, make a joke about, like, me being the man one in the family. She's like, oh, like, you're, like, the man of the house because you're gonna take care of me, and, like, you help around the house, like, you do all these things. And I just thought it was interesting how, like, again, these things, like, household tasks and whatever that are, like, traditionally ascribed to, like, femininity, she would frame as, like, being the man of the house. And so in that way, I feel like I'm getting a little off track, but, like, my upbringing has, like, fed me two completely different messages. And I think I've honestly internalized the one from my mom a lot more because she's the one that I respect the most. And she's the one who, like, really put the least pressure on me to conform to earn, like, respect and love to notions of femininity.
I think the most interesting thing I got from what you were saying was that, like, I want to make sure this can hear me, but, like, I think the most interesting thing I got from that was that the idea that, like, your mom, like, having, like, a matriarchal type of, like, family is something that kind of reframed your thinking. And also, like, I don't know, like, for me, like, and, like, for Black women, or, like, through like a lot of like Black feminist texts and like a lot of conversations I've had with just like Black women, like that's literally like, I don't know how to describe it, but like Black femininity and Black womanhood is built on taking care of people and kind of like having like matriarchal type of like households and like relationships with people. And I think rather like lack of choice, honestly, like we obviously we know from like systemic like issues of like mass incarceration and like, you know, like all these different types of things, like these things aren't really a choice. However, a lot of how we define womanhood is so like heavily linked to like how we take care of people. And so like my mom being like my mom was a single mom, and so like she took care of 5 kids, and so like that wasn't something that kind of like reframed my thinking about womanhood. Rather, it was literally that like that's what womanhood was. Like it was to be like strong and like independent and kind of like take care of anyone around you. And so I thought that was pretty interesting.
Oh yeah, that is interesting.
And so yeah, like very similarly, like some of the expectations put onto me from like childhood and even to adulthood around like womanhood or femininity is to like be very like this empathetic person who like takes care of everyone. And like, you know, like my very first like duty in life is to like take care of anyone who's ever, not even if they're taking care of me, but like that's just like what womanhood is to me, is to like have the ability to take care of those who you care about. And I think like all the women in my family have done just that, because I think for the past 3 generations everyone has been like single mothers. And like even now when I think of like other Black women who I know, it's similarly just like Black women being like the head of the households. And but also I very much so relate to the idea of like gendered household chores and things like that, because no matter what, like it made like my mom made sure that like despite Black women being the head of the house, you always should know that like you should never take out the trash. Like you should never do anything that like is heavily linked to maleness. So like anything that involves getting dirty. So like, and I think this also can go back to like the whole like mammifying Black women in terms of like taking care of babies and like doing like all the household chores that revolve around just like taking care of others versus like taking out the trash and something is very like something that like gets you dirty and things like that. And so I definitely heavily understand like what you were saying when it comes to that.
I remember also that we like talked about how it's interesting, and you said that like we're coming from like perspectives where we are like both kind of starting at the opposite ends.
I was gonna bring that up. And this is why like I think I struggled a lot in the class, and I kind of didn't say it a lot in class, but like I struggled a lot in this class to like really understand like these notions of femininity and like these notions of femininity and womanhood, because like we know that like womanhood or like femininity and like a racialized femininity is something that's like, you know, that like this hierarchy, right? And so we know that like we've talked about how like Black women are like at the bottom of this totem pole, but when we think about desirability and like all these concepts around femininity, like being docile and being fragile and being like small and like petite and all these different things, that's like the pinnacle of what like Asian women, but particularly Korean women, are seen as.
Exactly.
Versus like Black women are quite literally seen as the opposite of that. So like we don't have like the purity of like having light skin, and we don't have like the luxury of being associated to thinness and like all these different things that kind of like reinforce what femininity is for a lot of different people. And so like throughout the class, like I was struggling to be like, oh well, like, you know, I don't know how to frame this, but like so like we quite literally are like starting from very different ends of like notions of like femininity and like womanhood.
I know, it's like it's crazy to hear, because like this is something that like all links back to the same like underlying systemic issue. But I feel like what ends up happening is like I don't know, speaking from like the Korean woman perspective, there's like such a desire, especially now, I feel like, to escape these like associated qualities like you mentioned of like fragility and like being like docile and stuff, that like we think the way to counteract that is to like put ourselves in like roles that are more like dominant and be like it's
so like
kind of like
turn it on its head and like subvert it,
yeah,
basically.
kind of like how like the girl boss like feminist movement is like, oh, like I could be like a man too, like I could be president if I want to. And I'm like, that's not the solution though.
No, yeah,
it's more like why are we being perceived in this way, and how is it problematic for everyone involved, including Black women who are like facing on the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, and I think also like when we talk about Inda Clark, for example, I think like granted, like, I think that's why there was so much pushback to, like, her narrative and her being, like, you know, like, that. I feel like that's why a lot of the class conversation kind of shifted to her being about womanhood. But for me, I never questioned, like, you know, I never, like, reduced her back to that motherhood role. Because, like, for me, like, as Black women, like, a lot of the times when we talk about womanhood and femininity, like, Black women are already on the outskirts of that. You know, like, we don't have the privilege of being associated to those things. And so, like, when I read, like, this Korean woman, like, doing these things, I was very shocked, but I never questioned, like, oh, like, that makes her less of a woman, because Black women have been doing these things for so long. And I think, like, you know, and so, like, I just thought it was pretty interesting that people question, like, her womanhood in terms of how it relates to her motherhood and things like that. Because I know that, like, even when I talk about, like, my mother and some of the things that she has done, would she be considered a good mom, like, to other people? No, but, like, also I'm very aware and I'm able to conceptualize that, like, sometimes there are sacrifices that need to be made. And so that's why I literally did not blink an eye when we were talking about, like, Park and Duck and the sacrifice she had to make, and how, like, a lot of, through, like, her narrative, she was making a lot of strides for Korean women. So I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, that makes total sense. That, like, I feel like that definitely comes through, and because, like, we were so frustrated after that discussion.
No, we were very frustrated with that.
It's also, like, I think these struggles, although they're, like, again, derived from something that's, like, very similar, like, enemy-wise, I think there is, like, a ton of, I don't know, like, I want to say privilege. I don't know if that, like, captures, I guess, like, the full meaning of what I'm trying to say, but there is, like, way more privilege, I think, associated with being considered, like, the pinnacle of femininity.
Absolutely.
In a way that, like, and I think that, like, again, sitting at that position, it's, like, then a duty to, like, you know,
uphold it.
No, not uphold it, but like, if you sit at that, like, position of being, like, the quote male ideal of femininity, it's way easier to challenge it and, like, be kind of, like, I think you have, like, more credibility to the male eye if you're, like, the peak of womanhood, and then you're like,
absolutely.
but this is stupid, and,
but
like,
that's all desirability policy.
Exactly.
You know, like, it's all about
and
desirability.
So, like,
absolutely.
So I think that there's, like, there needs to be more emphasis on, like, especially, like, Korean women and, like, East Asian women, to kind of, mostly Korean women, though, because, I don't even want to get it, like, but I think there's, like, a lot of, like, power there, almost, to, like, fight against the gender system of being, like, okay, like, you guys see us as, like, your, I don't know, like, pinnacle of, like, femininity, but, like,
but I think,
let's, like, challenge that.
But I think, like, also, like, and I could be very wrong, but I think also, like, the desire to do that, or, like, not even the desire to do that, but, like, the construction of a narrative that, like, Korean women don't want to uproot that type of, like, system plays into, like, Korean women being submissive and, like, very quiet and, like, very okay with, like, their positionality. And so, like, I don't know, I feel like that kind of, like, impacts the way, like, Korean women might go around, like, these type of topics, just because, like, in the same breath that, like, there are things that need to change, it's also, like, there's a lot at stake around, like, you know, like, conceptions around, like, I don't know if I'm framing this in the right way. I don't know what I'm trying to say.
Are you saying, like, the idea that Korean women don't want to challenge this already is rooted in the idea that they're, like, submissive?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. And so, like, in doing that, it also might be a little hard to, like, actually challenge these things. And also, like, in the same way that, like, we were talking about in class how, like, there's, like, a nationalist sentiment around, like, who was actually out here, like, fighting against, like, when, I forgot what book that was, but, like, when we talk about, like, national sentiment, like, around comfort women, like, the idea that, like, comfort women aren't fighting and, like, all these different types of things, like, sentiment around like there isn't a fight there for Korean women kind of like reinforced the idea of like,
I
you know,
see.
you get what I'm saying? Like, yeah, so like, and so like there might actually be like a lot, you know, but like,
no, that's so true.
I think there's a lot of pushback around whenever like, I don't know how to say this, but like, I don't know. Yeah, like you get what I'm saying.
I know what you mean. Honestly, this is something that I'm constantly like so confused about how to think about, because like I lean overly like, I don't even want to say cynical, because I think it's deeper than that. I think I have like a lot of really bitter notions of like what Korean women are doing. Like, I don't know, in terms of like, I think the communities that I've immersed myself in have just been either unrepresentative of like Korean women or representative of a very specific harmful like part of it. Because like my experience was mostly when I was like in the Christian Korean church in middle school, and there it was like, honestly, it was like deeply homophobic, very heteronormative, and incredibly misogynistic. And there was a lot of like, women were not there for each other. There was like a lot of just like shame around like sex. There was a lot of like just bad shit. And that honestly was like a huge reference point for me in conceiving how Korean women are. And to the point where I'm like, I err in like the opposite direction for a lot of these things. And I am a Korean woman. So of course, like, logically one would be like, there are literally other people who are like this, like, of course. And I'm doing no service to like the greater community by assuming that there aren't people like this. But I've honestly met like very few Korean like women at BU even who haven't like said things that kind of like raise alarms for me, like around like, I don't know, just like liberation of women, or like, I don't know, it's like stuff relating to like race that like kind of stress me out, or that like, fair. I don't know. And so I think this like criticism that like there probably are people who are like fighting the fight, I just don't know about it, that's like definitely true. But I'm like, where, like, I just haven't been able to really like see that many people like,
yeah, I understand.
and so that. I'm definitely being closed-minded, and I'm like, I don't know like what avenue to use to like meet other people, but like,
yeah, I think very understandably also like, I also like, in my very few interactions with like Korean women, I think I also like have failed to like come into contact with a lot of Korean women who are very like critical of the way like Korean women are perceived and things like that. And I also think for me it makes me especially frustrated, and I can't imagine for you like actually being a Korean woman like being especially frustrated, but like for me it makes me frustrated because I'm like, man, like I know what it's like. Listen, I know what it's like on the other side, and like, you know, like I know what it's like, and I know how much liberation it could bring, but also like I take that with a grain of salt because I also like was forced to be on the other side, and so definitely. Like, you know, and so I think that's something I had to grapple with, even when thinking about like, I remember when we were talking about like Lady Haegung, for example, and how like when Professor Young was like, yeah, like this is very groundbreaking, and I was like, what's groundbreaking about this woman writing a narrative about like, you know, about like her husband? And then like when it was explained that like, you know, like when it was explained that like this was groundbreaking because like this wasn't something women did, you know, and all those types of things, I was like, man, like I'm being a little too harsh on like what I think would bring women liberation. And like, you know, like I kept comparing it to like how black women throughout history have done things, but also like black women have always been on the outskirts of like what women are supposed to be and all these types of things. So it's very much so easier, and that's why like I don't know if I agree with you when you said it was easier to like flip narratives around like femininity and womanhood when you're at the top, just because of like desirability politics. I think it might be a little easier for people who are on the outskirts, and I think that's what we've seen throughout history and throughout like the history of like how like these women are perceived, and how like the feminism and like activism around like Korean womanhood and black womanhood have been shaped. I think it's a lot easier to kind of like turn something on its head when you have always been excluded from it, because you're like, listen, I am what I am. Like, I am a woman, but I don't fit your definitions of it. And so it's up to you to fix that. And so I'm here to tell you, like, exactly how harmful this stuff can be. But sometimes, like, it can be a little harder when you're on the inside to do that. And I think, you know, and so...
I see, because, like, risk of, like, losing.
Exactly.
I see,
because also when we talk about, like... When we talk about things like sexism and when we talk about, like, feminism and things like that, all these things can very easily turn into a zero-sum game, you know?
Yeah,
like, and so, like...
I see what you're saying.
The only way I can fix this system is if I lose my positionality, you know?
I see.
And so, like, that could also be a struggle that, like, people are faced with.
That's interesting, because I feel like there is, like, a big narrative around, like, changing the system from the inside, but I see what you're saying, where it's, like, once you, like, lose your, I guess, like, almost stake in upholding it, it's, like, I don't know if I want to say easier, but it is way more, like, maybe impactful to, like, and you're right, like, the work that has been done in, like, deconstructing these things, like, has mainly been from Black women, not, like, but I know what you're saying. I agree.
And I also, but that is something I learned from this class, so, like, I remember also being like, man, like, y'all haven't done the work, you know? And I think I was very critical because, like, as Black women, you know, we've always been at the forefront of, like, these types of things. And so it gets very frustrating. But also, like, I think this class has taught me to, like, you know, be more empathetic than I already am when it comes to, like, talking about how, like, Korean women are very, like, simultaneously constructing their own womanhood, but also, like, deconstructing the narratives that have been placed around them. And so, like, that's something I was thinking about throughout this class. But, like, I kind of want to talk about, like, I don't know how to, like, it's a two-part question. So, like, if your personal definition around womanhood has shifted, how did you previously define womanhood, and how do you define it now? And also, when we talk about womanhood and your definitions, how do you, like, what things do you do that allow yourself to express your femininity or, like, connect to your womanhood? Like, it can be outside, it can be inside, and things like that.
Oh,
I know.
This is a good question. Oh my God. I'm going to think about it. But first, like, this is something that I struggle with so much to, like, define for myself, because the first question I ask myself is, like, because the first kind of, like, way I confronted womanhood was through my sexuality.
Oh, really?
And that was the first time I really thought about it. And then through this class, honestly, this class challenged me to not just, like, abandon the importance of womanhood and say, like, fuck it, it's, like, benign, like, why does it matter? And, like, this actually does matter a lot, and, like, what does it mean to me now? But the way I approached it from, like, being a lesbian was that I was like, what about me is, like, a woman in the sense of womanhood? Nothing. And therefore, like, why does it matter? And, like, therefore it doesn't matter, and, like, it's stupid. And then I was like that for a while. And then I was like, I think this is a hand-wavy way to approach something that's one of the first things people will see about me, and one of the most prevalent ways I've learned to see the world. Like, that's a big lens for me. I can't just, like, ignore it. And it feels, honestly, like a disservice almost to be like, I am, like, not attached to this at all. Like, I want to, like, explore the ways in which I'm, like, forced to be attached to it, and the ways in which, like, being attached to it could help me, like, empathize with other people who are like deeply attached to it. But yeah, like, I guess to get into some background, like, couple years ago, when I was, like, really thinking about, like, my sexuality relative to being a Korean woman. This is, like, what my project is about also, but I was like, okay, the things that, like, my childhood has kind of taught me are, like, really important to Korean womanhood is, like, being, like, a good, and this is, like, the problematic, like, whatever, outdated, like, notions, but it's, like, being a good wife to a husband. I'm not gonna be that. I was, like, not gonna have a husband. Being a good mother to kids, like, this is not necessarily, like, a lesbian thing, but I was like, I'm probably not gonna have kids, so, like, there's that. And then being, like, a daughter to, like, parents, for my dad, I, like, don't have that relationship, and then with my mom, I'm kind of, like, the son almost, because I'm, like, I'm taking on that thing where, like, usually the oldest son, like, supports the parents, or, like, takes them in, like, they live with each other. so I'm taking that on. So I'm like, okay, I'm like a son. So what about me is like womanly? And then I also feel very like, I don't want to say like masculine, but I think that like a lot of people when they hear lesbian kind of like impose some amount of either hyper feminine fetishization on you or like they masculinize you. And I'm like, I haven't related as much to like the like hyper feminized like fetishization as I have, thank you so much, in the Korean community as like having masculinity imposed onto me. I think a lot of people outside of the Korean community still do like impose hyper femininity onto me, and they're like, okay, like lesbianism is like kind of eroticized like forcibly, especially by like men, white men, whatever. But in Korean communities, I feel a little bit like they're seeing me as like less of like a girl, less of a woman. And so my approach through like being gay to womanhood, it was that way. And then now the way that I'm like trying to figure out how to define it has been through like, how does this allow me to relate to other Korean women? Like that's how I'm trying to figure out how I feel about womanhood, which is to say that I don't really know like what my current definition
and that's completely
is.
fair. But
I'm trying to approach it way more in like not what does this mean for my individual identity, but like what does this mean about me fitting into like the greater narrative of like Korean women and like how they've moved through society and like what we could do. So I'm trying to like take in this information that we've like learned in class and also just like see in my life like really like healthy and like fruitful, I guess, like female relationships and dynamics. And I'm like, okay, like where does this come from? Like what qualities do like women have that allows these like relationships and dynamics and stuff, and like what does that mean for like me being a woman? And so I guess that's the way I've been trying to like sort through my feelings about it, but I literally have no idea. I'm like, what the fuck is it? Like, what is a woman? Like,
no, absolutely. I think before we move on to the second part of the question, like I 100% understand. Like I think, and you know, I talked about this earlier, where like womanhood, how I previously defined it, was like heavily in relation to like how I'm taking care of others and how like I can kind of be as like docile and like as like fragile as I possibly could while also remaining resilient and like being strong, because that's what Black womanhood was. And kind of for me, like I was battling, or like I was internally conflicted for a very long time around womanhood, because like in the same sense that like, and this is kind of where like the concepts of like individuality come into play and like collectivity, like why? But like I think like whenever I thought about like womanhood or like femininity and like my gender, I kind of like was battling with the conversation of like a greater notion of like white definitions around womanhood, in terms of like you have to be like hyper feminine and you have to be like very docile and like fragile, and you also have to be like very meek and quiet and like all these different types of things. But at the same time, like for Black women, it was kind of like trying to be all those things, but like you have to be kind of like strong, like you have to be strong and you have to like be at the forefront. And like for a lot of white women and for a lot of like other women of color particularly, that wasn't something that like was like a norm. And so like for me, whenever I thought about womanhood, it was kind of, I was very conflicted between those two. And like I'm very similar now, like I don't know what my definition of womanhood is. And I think like that's the whole point of why I'm doing this exhibit, is because like the only people who can truly define womanhood are women themselves. But like, and I think in a world where like women or people who identify as women are constantly battling like all these different types of like forced definitions about what womanhood is, I think it's very hard to kind of find like your individuality in all of that. And so I think also I'm at the same point where like I don't know how to define womanhood, and all I know is like for how I define my womanhood now is like whatever I'm going through, because that's what womanhood is. Like me, I identify as a woman, and like whatever I'm going through is what womanhood is. And I think in the same breath that like we talk about like being feminine and like being docile, I think you can be all those things and be a woman, but I also think you can be the very opposite of that. And I think that goes into like the next part of my question around, like, what are some things that you do that kind of, like, for yourself reaffirm your womanhood? Yeah.
That's a good question. I honestly, like... Oh my god, I was gonna say something. Hold on, let me think.
Or, like, things that you do to, like, that allow you to express your femininity. And how it relates to, like, maybe your continuing process of, like, defining your womanhood.
Okay. Oh my god. Okay, so... So I talked about this a lot last year with my therapist because I told her that I was, like, going through a crisis, especially trying to, like... So last year I was, like, actively, like, dating, and this raised a lot of questions about femininity and kind of, like, the roles you get placed to relative to other women. And so I often felt like I was being placed into a role where I was taking on more, like, dominance, and it made me and it made me feel... No one was saying this or, like, asking this of me, but I, as a result, felt very out of touch with my femininity. Or at least the way I had constructed, like, femininity before.
Yeah.
Which was, like, it's kind of like, when I look back at it, I was like, I was being real dramatic because it really didn't have to be like that. Like, I was still literally, like, I was literally fine. Yeah. But I was so dramatic with my therapist. I was like, I just don't know, like, who I am anymore. Like, I feel like I'm being placed into this, like, box that I'm not. And all of these things. I think when it came down to it, it's just because I was, like, not being myself, which is not necessarily related to, like, submissiveness or dominance or anything. It was just, like, a me problem. But during that time, I, hold on, what was I gonna say? Oh, yeah, during that time, I felt very out of touch with my, like, femininity and whatnot. And so my therapist was like, okay, maybe you should, like, take a step back and, like, figure yourself out before you're, like, trying to, like, date these other people, like, you know, and, like, and experiencing kind of yourself in reference to them, which is something that I, like, always, this is kind of, like, what I said about, like, womanhood before, where it's like you are constantly something relative to someone else. And that's how I felt, even, like, dating just women. I was like, okay, like, relative to this, like, very girly person, like, I am less girly, and therefore like I don't feel that, like, feminine. And so she was like, yeah, you should probably, like, work on that. And I was like, you're right. And so I think something that she, like, told me to do more, because I told her that I really liked this, was, like, journaling and writing a lot. And I told her, before she even gave me that advice, I told her that, like, a big source of discomfort for me in social situations is when I feel like there's a discrepancy between the way I perceive myself and the way others perceive me.
Definitely, yeah.
But when I write, I am exactly who I am, like, saying I am, and no one can perceive that writing other than me if it's private.
You sound like homegirl.
And so...
You sound just like
so insufferable. It's like, but I was like, there's no, like, tension when I'm, like, writing between, like, an outside eye versus me. Like, I can say whatever, and that's, like, I take it at face value when I read it back to myself. So I was, like, writing a lot, and that honestly helped me a lot. Like, it sounds so unrelated because it's not gendered at all, but, like, writing has honestly helped me come to terms with, like, the various ways I don't relate to, like, womanhood and the various ways I do. Like, so much. Like, that has been, like, a big way I feel, like, more connected to, like, my own definition of, like, womanhood. And also, like, I think being really honest with myself because this is, like, honestly, like, I want to say, like, battleground is, like, so dramatic for it, but this is, like, where everything plays out.
Yeah.
It's, like, my dating life. That's where a lot of these, like, self perceptions of my, like, femininity come into play, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna be really honest with myself about, like, who I am, and, like, not try to, like, act a role because that, like, that role is more, like, you know, in demand. You know? Like, everyone wants a top. I'm not, I can't be that, like, all the time. So, like, being honest with myself with that has helped me connect more. And these are, like, I think upon reflection, these are still very, like, superficial things. And I'm trying to, like, work on what is, like, a deeper way, I guess, to, like, think of myself beyond, like, dating someone and, like, having them view me a certain way. Like, I think it's not that it's bad, but it's not necessarily like the main point of exploring like womanhood and femininity, but that's definitely an avenue through which I'm like understanding more like what I need. And then I guess also like focusing a lot on like relationships with other like of my like girlfriends and like and things like that, and understanding that like connecting to others is a big part of like womanhood, and like the way you do it I think is a big part of womanhood, and trying to like focus on those things and like connect with people based on like shared joys and like struggles and whatnot. So that's a really good question. I'm like figuring it out, but I guess that's what I've been doing so far.
I mean I 100% I understand that completely. I think heavy on like all these conceptions of like your femininity and womanhood showing up in dating is so prevalent. And I think it's even more interesting when you talk about like a non like heteronormative type of like dating setting, like dating like ritual and like all those scripts and stuff like that. I think for me, like I'm straight, so like I'm heterosexual, and so like a lot of the times when it comes to like expressing, I think when it comes to the very basis of like being viewed as a woman in relationship to my partner, that's something I never have to question, because my partner will always be male or a man, and so like that's something I never had to kind of like understand about myself, or like something I never had to battle with. However, I think when it comes to like the very basic facts of like I'm a dark-skinned fat black woman, and I think like when we talk about conversations around femininity and like I don't know if this is common knowledge, but I hopefully one day it will be, is that like when we talk about femininity and womanhood, body size is a thing that's also very like prevalent, and when it comes to like being allowed to like be seen as like feminine and docile and like all these different types of things. And I think it's something that isn't talked about often. And like, so for example, for me, like I'm a fat woman, and so like a lot of the times I'm not allowed to be perceived as like more fragile or more like you know, like just a basic like because when you think of like femininity, you picture this very like petite like type of woman and things like that, and so immediately I'm on the outskirts of that. And then also like we know that like historically skin color and like more specifically like lightness, regardless of like race, like whenever you're lighter in that particular shade of like range or whatever, it allows you to be seen as something that's more pure and something that's more like, you know, something that needs to be protected. And so like I'm quite literally on the opposite of that. And so like while through my relationships I will never be questioned around like my womanhood, I'm often like perceived as more masculine than I am, like and so I think I see a lot of like how I present myself on the outside in terms of like how I'm trying to grapple with like my conceptions of my own womanhood and femininity at the same time. And so like I tell people all the time like I'm very hyper feminine, and like I am, I like very like, I don't like to say girly things, but I like very feminine things, like, and I don't want to, you know, like it gets problematic if I associate these things with femininity, like pink and like all these different types of things, because like those can be like things that can be masculine as well. But I think these are things that like allow me to express my femininity. And so like I'm a very like theatrical person, and so we know that like masculinity, like people who are very masculine don't talk with their hands and like do all these different types of things. And so I feel like in order to kind of counteract like people's perceptions of me and kind of like match it up with how I perceive myself as a woman, I do a lot of things that like I know people will like perceive automatically as more feminine. And so like sometimes when I'm talking to men, I speak in a higher pitch because my voice is naturally, and I think a lot of black women's voices are very naturally like lower, but like I speak in a higher pitch sometimes. Like I'm very like theatrical when I speak. I do my makeup all the time, like, you know, and I always make sure I present myself in a way that's like clean cut and like all these different things, like things that kind of like are subtly reaffirming my femininity. And like while at the same time it's something that could easily be kind of like deconstructed around like how like I'm kind of like reinforcing the ideas of what femininity is. I think that's the whole point of like my definition, or the little things I do to express my femininity are not what I'm imposing on other people, or like what I'm imposing on other women to be like how we should view women. I think these are things that I do individually that allow me to express my femininity, while working in tandem with the fact that like I have very basic characteristics about myself that are on the outskirts of what other people consider to be feminine, or like attach me to like conceptions of womanhood.
Like that makes so much sense. Also, like this idea of like having to counteract something that is like ascribed onto you, and whether or not that's a choice. I feel like the enjoyment aspect is often like criticized and called into question, but it's like very much like it's not like someone else's like thing to comment on. You know, like if you like this at the same time as like feeling like a certain pressure, not that you like said that you do, but if that's like dual factors, like that makes a lot of sense. And also like what you were saying before about like just all of these different like factors contributing to like being on the outskirts, I feel like this is like, again, like going back to like dating or just even the way people like treat you, there's like a lot of like just lack of like tenderness and care that's afforded when like people you're dating like don't see you as like delicate or like in need of like being taken care of, and like these are qualities that like these things like are usually associated with like what we were saying before is like the qualities that are like the pinnacle of femininity, like like lightness and like thinness and all of these things. Like people are like, oh, this is someone who like deserves to be like, you know, like doted on.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And like that becomes such a, I don't know, hard thing to like navigate when you're like trying to find like someone who you do want to like take care of you but not see you as like less than because of it. And it's just like, it's like so juggling it is endlessly difficult.
And I think and I think that's the whole point of like this entire conversation. I think that's the whole point around like what I've gained from the class is that like I've had so much and I think we all have had like criticisms of like the women who we've read in this class, and I think I question a lot of like their intentions around like reshaping womanhood and femininity, and especially when it comes, because for a long time I was like, how is this doing anything for Korean women? Like when we talked about like in Duck Park, for example, and like Lady Hae-kyung and like even Grace Cho and like all these women who were doing the works of like understanding the experiences of Korean women. And I think like the biggest thing I got from the class was the biggest thing I got and like was that like it's not like what we say that define womanhood or specifically Korean womanhood or femininity and all these different things. It's literally the lived experiences of us. It's the lived experiences of
that's
Park.
true.
It's the lived experience of Lady Hae-kyung. Like it's all of their own like lived experiences and personal narratives and like how they conceptualize their womanhood that define womanhood. Like that's literally
that's like when you said that before, I forget how you phrased it, but you were like, oh, to me like the definition is like what I'm going through. And I was like, damn, like that's literally so true, because it's like it's so hard to like talk about it and boil it down almost to like kind of a set of like rules, but to say like my life is like womanhood, that makes like a lot more sense. And I feel like that's crazy that your takeaway was that, because I literally have not even thought about what my takeaway from the class is, but that's like, I don't know, I feel like you genuinely like have done like the work, because it's so understandable that like you're reading these things and you're like, okay, like how is Lady Hae-kyung, you know, like compared to like the other work that I've seen in like feminism like in America, like driven by Black women and like this and that, like how is that comparable? And it's like not, but it's very like different in the context. So I feel like coming to that understanding is like really hard, because you're like looking at these things that these Korean women are saying are like almost a luxury to have, and you're like, this isn't a luxury for me. Like this is not like a choice that I had, and like I guess I like have these things, but it's like why do you like want this and like all this? But it's like I don't know, our perspectives being like from such like
such
it's so
different,
I don't know, it's so interesting.
I definitely agree. I don't know, like in context of like both of us coming from very different ends of like the hierarchy, for example, when we talk about femininity and womanhood, kind of like my last question, or like kind of how I want to end this is like, what do you hope for in the future of like how like Korean womanhood for you, or like femininity or womanhood in general is defined?
Oh,
and I know
that's
it's
a good
question.
Damn.
I know it's a huge question, but
I think a personal goal of mine, and then I guess I think I need to think about like a broader, maybe like community-based goal, but like
you can focus on yourself. It's fine. Yeah, no, absolutely. Go ahead.
I think a personal goal for like defining femininity for me is like to figure out like literally, like why is it important that I do that, and what should I focus on like while I'm figuring out that definition. And also, like, I think something that I struggle with a lot is like, and I really want to like, I want to say there was this essay that I read by Andrea Long Chu, I want to say last semester, where she talked a lot about like what womanhood means to her, and she's I believe she's an Asian trans woman, and she was talking a lot about how like she's allowed to want things that people say are like undermining femininity.
Absolutely.
Or like undermining like the fight in like deconstructing like womanhood and all of this.
Yeah.
And I read that and I was like, this is so like important to read.
Yeah.
Because she was like, people like will always be like, why do you want to wear like high heels and lipstick and like all these things, like these are stupid things, like you should be like trying to like do the like more work and then she was like, why, like literally why?
Yeah.
And then I was like, and then I like had this idea of like the stupid shit phenomenon, where it's like you are allowed to want things that people say are like stupid.
Absolutely.
Because they're always gonna like, especially relating to femininity, there's like such, understandably there was like the whole like, oh, like we don't want these things just associated with like what it means to be a woman. But I'm like, but like maybe we should think about like why are these considered bad to be associated with like womanhood and all of this. So I guess like something that I'm trying to work on for myself is like letting myself want things that feel superficial and like not letting it become, you know, like the main focus, or letting it get too far where like all I'm focused on is like feeling pretty and things like that. But being able to be like, it's like okay sometimes, you know,
absolutely.
to like want to do these things that are like literally, I guess, considered like stupid shit.
Yeah.
Like it's fine.
No, absolutely.
Like,
I think you low-key just gave me the title of like my project, stupid shit.
Stupid
But like
shit.
absolutely, and that's kind of what I was hinting at earlier about like,
yeah, I know when you were saying that, I was
like,
like, yep, this is
like it's okay, like, and I think often a lot of times when we talk about womanhood and femininity, we kind of like go along the timeline of like the women who are kind of in power, and so when white women are tired of like the high heels and lipsticks, they're ready to move on.
Yeah,
and do something
exactly.
Deeper.
No,
but like
you're
for
right.
women, for like women who have not ever had the privilege of being able to attain those things,
yes,
those are very like critical things that kind of like reaffirm our identity, and it's the type of things that reaffirm our womanness and our femininity. And like for me, that's why it's like, yeah, like you might think it's problematic that I want to wear makeup in order to express my femininity, because like why should a woman have to do that? But at the same time, like these are things that like I'm actively doing that are like defining my womanhood and like reaffirming the fact that like I can be feminine and I can be this very thing that I feel on the inside. And so like, yeah, like people, like women, I think that's what I hope for the future, is that we all kind of get on the wave of like, there is no like set of rules, or like there's no specific things of like that define womanhood, or like that women or like people who are feminine should like think or do. Yeah, it's kind of like do whatever you want, you know. And like if it's the stupid shit that you want in life,
no, literally,
you know.
Yeah, that's, oh my god, I totally agree. I'm like, oh my god, this is not super related, but like we talked about this a lot in my like arts of gender class, where like a lot of people, when we watched Pose, I don't know if you've seen it.
I've seen Pose.
Oh my god, okay. So we watched Pose, and like there was a scene where like Angel gets a pair of like the red heels from Blanca, and there were some people in my class who were like, oh, like I just feel like there's a lot of like activism and like work that could be done in this community, and like I feel like sometimes it could be misogynistic from these women in the show to like uphold these. It was just like, it was so bad. And they were like, oh, it's like a misogynistic conception of womanhood to focus on so many superficial things. And I was like, this is not...
No.
This is a bad take.
It is,
and I was
also,
like,
that's womanhood to them. Like,
yeah,
you know?
And
yeah.
what you said about you using these things to define your own womanhood, coming from a place where, like, people are constantly undermining it, like, this is literally how it's done. And,
yeah,
like,
absolutely.
who are you to say, like, especially, for, like, Angel.
Yeah, no, yeah,
I was like, dude, like...
Yeah.
Like, you've never wanted a pair of heels? Like, relax.
Absolutely.
And I don't know. It was just, like, really interesting because I was like... And then we read, like, the Andrea Long Chu essay, and I was like, some of you guys, like, please. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Stupid shit.
Yeah. But yeah. Any final thoughts around, like, this conversation?
I thought your questions were all so good. Like, you made me think so much. I honestly, I think for me, just like final note is that I really like don't know a lot of these questions. It's like this idea of like womanhood and femininity. I'm like really working on it, and I think just like looking at what other people say too, whose like upbringings I relate to or like opinions I respect a lot. Like looking at what they say and like the work they've had to do, I think is gonna like help me. But this is like a good question to ponder on.
Good.
So. Yeah, I had a good time.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you.